I thought I would just read you the motivation for the prize, which is the Edelstam Prize is awarded for exceptional courage within the defense of human rights. It's established in my grandfather's name, Mr. Edelstam, who was a diplomat who saved many lives during his career. First, he was a diplomat in Norway during the Second World War, where he functioned as a link in the resistance movement and saved many Jews during that time. And he was later the Swedish ambassador to Chile during the coup and opened up the Swedish embassy and helped save more than 1,000 lives in Chile during this time. So, Mr. Juan Guzman, he was the first judge appointed in Chile to decide about the criminal complaints filed against the former dictator Pinochet. And it seemed unlikely that a conservative judge would take this task seriously, but these expectations soon proved to be wrong. Increasingly moved by his interviews with victims and the overwhelming evidence against Pinochet, he underwent a personal process of understanding until he finally persuaded the Supreme Court to waive Pinochet's immunity. Guzman indicted the former dictator on counts of kidnapping and assassination. He performed investigations throughout the country in order to find the remains of about 1,200 political prisoners who were still missing. Further, he established that the kidnapping of people who subsequently disappeared was a permanent crime to be prosecuted in spite of amnesties and statutes of limitations. Guzman indicted a great number of members of the armed forces. He showed great civic courage pursuing his investigations. In spite of threats, Judge Guzman opened an important path for justice in Chile, which many judges up until today are following. The Edelstam Foundation recognizes the need of international legislation promoting accountability for serious abuses against human rights and the responsibility of the states where violations have occurred, and the international community as well, in order to establish justice, ensure the protection of victims, and most important, to avoid impunity. We should not let history repeat itself. So with these words, I would like to leave the floor to Mr. Guzman.
Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry I'm a little bit agitated, but I'll try to take my breath as soon as I feel that I talk. I will get more tranquil in a minute. The coup and the dictatorship. The 11th of September 1973, the sky over Santiago was covered by a huge black cloud followed by enormous flames. Democracy was the presidential palace, La Moneda, had been bombed by a squadron of airplanes belonging to the Air Force. Hundreds of persons were killed or severely injured, being one of the first victims, President Salvador Allende, who gave his life to his country. A military junta began to rule over the country. The parliament was suspended. A harsh curfew that lasted 3 years was imposed, and thousands of persons were persecuted, captured, tortured, killed, and disappeared. This military dictatorship ruled for 17 years, in which more than 3,000 100 persons were killed, assassinated. More than 1,200 continue disappeared, and over 36,000 people, they were much more. But that's what the number that we have obtained is the closest. More than 36,000 were roughly tortured, and hundreds of secret police were spread all over the country. And dozens of hundreds were fired from their jobs and exiled, besides having suffered all sorts of violations to their human rights. This is also sad what I'm going to tell. More than 10,000 habeas corpus writs, recursos de amparo, more than 10,000 habeas corpus writs were rejected and archived. The courts of appeals, competent tribunals in these issues, requested information from the offices in charge of the detentions. It's like asking the wolf where his prey may be. Naturally, the only answer received by the courts of appeals was a laconic no. We don't know anything about the prisoners or the disappeared or whatever you need. At the same time, the tribunals in charge of criminal matters performed very superficially their investigations and ended their dossier in acquittals. An intelligence bureau called DINA, Dirección de Inteligencia Nacional, was created with the task of suppressing the Communist Party, its members, and other left-wing organizations. The skills of this bureau were used to imprison, interrogate, torture, assassinate, or to have their victims disappear. For an important part of the population, a pitiless inferno had begun. But in the worst of this desolation and darkness, an angel appeared. During the first month of this tyranny, Swedish ambassador in Chile, Harald Edelstam, who had a broad experience in saving the weak in occupied countries and dictatorships, with the appropriate skill, imagination, great courage, managed to liberate political prisoners from the National Stadium in Santiago that had been transformed into a great concentration camp, the biggest in the country. This way, risking his own life, he saved the life of more than 1,000 political prisoners. Some institutions, like the church, and numerous human rights lawyers, with great courage as well, took the defense of the enemies within that were in danger or falsely accused. It is important to mention that during this military occupation, absolute impunity regarding the violation of human rights was absolutely imposed. I put little titles to my small chapters. Justice, justice at last. In January 1998, many years after this dictatorship ended, a criminal complaint was filed against General Pinochet. This complaint came into my hands when I was a justice at the Court of Appeals of Santiago. This complaint accused him and others, General Pinochet y otros, as the authors of kidnappings, assassination, torture, and genocide. The general feeling expressed by my colleagues at court and most of the lawyers of the forum was that it was impossible to try Pinochet. Some even smiled, imagining that Pinochet may be interrogated, accused, or even interrogated. Nevertheless, I considered seriously that it was necessary to discover the truth regarding the facts and establishing the eventual responsibility of Pinochet and the crimes attributed to him. Therefore, I then studied the pertinence of his complaint, its relevance, as well as the seriousness of the charges exposed, and then I accepted the case and filed a subpoena warrant to the witnesses mentioned in the complaint and accepted the evidence enclosed. Obviously, this case was not just an ordinary case. The people spoke, the judges, the reporters at the court, the lawyers, we all spoke about the hot potato. We all knew what we were speaking about. Obviously then, this case was not just an ordinary one. It implied great danger, a possible coup d'etat. And besides that, it would produce great changes. We have to remember that General Pinochet had been the most powerful man in Chile, and that he continued being one of the most important. Once I received the necessary information regarding the remains of some victims, and having been provided with a competent crew composed by civil police officers and forensic staff, my team and I began to visit different sites in the north of Chile, in the deserts, afterwards in the cemeteries all over the country, then in riverbanks, and finally in regiments, military regiments. It was even necessary to improvise elevators pulled by tractor motors to be able to descend into the shafts of abandoned mines. Most of these prospections that we overtook, afterwards we found out that they were wild goose chases in a great, most of these were false. We went to sites in certain places, directed sometimes by ex-soldiers or by the relatives of victims, and we searched days and days and days without finding anything at all. We only, in the desert and in cemeteries, we must have discovered the identity of not more than 10 victims. There's something I'd like to tell. This may be a bit of Jules Verne, but it is not. We investigated over 1,500 human remains in the different cemeteries. After finding and exhuming the remains of many persons, it was necessary to determine the cause of their deaths and try to find out who those remains had belonged to when alive. History began to change. The disappeared appeared. people who had attacked soldiers had been found with bullet shots on their backs. Executions that were supposed to be legal turned out to be absolute slaughters, and most of them absolutely fake. While these transformations were produced, General Pinochet was being imprisoned in London, obeying to an extradition warrant filed by the Spanish judiciary. This imprisonment implied a very important landmark for the development of the cases that I was investigating. It proved to the whole world the nature of the crimes that were being investigated. This was done, this enormous and courageous intervention was performed mainly by Carlos Castresana as prosecutor at the Spanish courts, by the lawyer Juan and by the judge Baltasar Garzón. It was the light of universal jurisdiction that began to perform with another form of justice that had not been really developed yet, apart from the doctrines. This was the practice, the live practice of the universal jurisdiction that began. It is fair to say that Pinochet's detention and the activity of the judiciary in Spain and England have also been considered as the biggest, or one of the biggest examples of universal jurisdiction in the last periods of our history. The amnesty and impunity. One of the most important issues investigated had to deal with the forced disappearance of people. Crimes that produced great sorrow and grief to the relatives of these victims. In 1978, 5 years after the coup d'etat, the dictatorship enacted an amnesty decree that established absolute impunity for the authors of the crimes committed in Chile between the 11th of September 1973, date of the coup, and the 10th of March 1978. In the case of the forced disappearances or of the kidnappings, according to our domestic law, it was necessary to distinguish whether these crimes had been committed during the first 5 years covered by the amnesty or not. After finding out, I realized that practically all of them had started to be committed during those 5 years, but continued to be perpetrated after that lapse. Meanwhile, the victims continued to disappear. Therefore, when the 1978 amnesty was argued by the defendants, I rejected the petition and continued my investigations and accused those who were responsible of these crimes, among them General Pinochet. Another legal tool that was utilized was the statute of limitations that also was argued. Nevertheless, I considered that this exception could only be argued in the criminal crime and not, that is, after the investigation, and not during the investigations. I still didn't have very clear whether we were, that if we really had jurisdiction over these crimes. We were studying that we investigated, we were learning at the same time. It was very new. That is, universal jurisdiction was something very new, and we experimented with our own trials or investigations. The statute of double jeopardy was also argued, but with very little success, due to the fact that most of the defendants had never been tried before. It's necessary 3 requirements, and one of the to be able to argue double jeopardy, and one of them naturally is that they have to be, the persons, the defendants have to be either acquitted or convicted, one of the two, and neither were the defendants acquitted nor convicted before. On the other hand, the judges had begun to apply universal jurisdiction concepts related with international treaties. After having obtained the lifting of General Pinochet's immunity as former president of Chile and later senator for life, and after having interrogated him, I accused him of the crimes. I say accused, but it's really indicted. I indicted him for the crimes of assassination and kidnapping in the episodes of Caravan of Death and Operación Condor. My accusations were overruled, naturally, by my superior courts, invoking that General Pinochet was not mentally fit. Finally, he passed away accused in a case known as Operación Colombo for the disappearance of 119 victims. As a conclusion, the results of these cases are important to Chile, its people, and to the rest of the world, because finally truth was established regarding the violation of human rights and the existence of crimes against humanity. The good reputation of thousands of victims that have been accused of terrorism and treason was re-established. The results are important because hundreds of state agents continued to be accused and convicted in various episodes that had been investigated after 1998. They are important as well because impunity regarding the most important and the most heinous crimes committed during the military dictatorship came to an end, and because future dictators and tyrants all over the world now will be aware that truth and justice are liable to prevail over impunity. Thank you very much.
Good morning, all of you. And to explain, I brought This is a short presentation that I use, as you see, every summer, and course of human rights and transitional justice with the Swiss government. And it explains basically what universal jurisdiction is, what the legal grounds are, what the fundament of what we did from Spain concerning General Pinochet and the crimes committed in Chile during the dictatorship from the Audiencia Nacional. So, going to the starting point of what we know today as principle of complementarity, according to the wording of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. It is really not something new. There was at least an agreement in the Charter of the United Nations in 1945 at the end of the Second World War, when the international community discovered that many victims, most of the victims of the Second World War had died in the rear guard. Victims or their own governments, that the traditional approach of social contract to protect human rights, like an agreement between the citizens and the governments in every territory, was not useful anymore, that a global social contract was necessary, and then that the right of the international community, and not only the right, the duty to intervene to protect citizens everywhere when they were victims of egregious abuses of human rights was established. You can find it in the Charter of the United Nations, Articles 55, 56. You can find it in decisions of the International Court of Justice. You can find it coming to criminal law in the Nuremberg Charter and Statute and Judgment. But the problem is that immediately after that, in 1945, after the trials in Nuremberg and the trials in Tokyo, the Cold War, the right of the international community, and not only the right, the duty to intervene to protect citizens everywhere when they were victims of egregious abuses of human rights was established. You can find it in the Charter of the United Nations, Articles 55, 56. You can find it in decisions of the International Court of Justice. You can find it coming to criminal law in the Nuremberg Charter and Statute and Judgment. But the problem is that immediately after that, in 1945, after the trials in Nuremberg and the trials in Tokyo, the Cold War began, and all this doctrine and all these principles got frozen during half a century. This is the list of the domestic armed conflict we have been suffering, and we can see that after 1946, basically the international community has not had peace at all, never, even if the Second World War ended. So what we humbly, progressive prosecutors in Spain, after having been outside of the international community for more than 40 years, because we were a dictatorship ourselves, tried to give to the international community as just born loyal members of that community, was establishing a precedent, because the referent until then and until today maybe is Nuremberg. But Nuremberg was the victor's justice, so the reason of force is very easy to put before a court of justice those you have previously defeated, because they lost and then they have to pay the consequences. But the question is, it is possible a victim's justice? So it is possible to bring to justice the perpetrators that had not been previously defeated? It was the challenge. And the rules were there, are still there. The question is how to enforce them. This duty to prosecute is established clearly in the two covenants, the civil and political rights and economic, social and cultural rights, both of them called war covenants. This is the reason because they are divided, the civil and political and the social and cultural, and both of them approved in 1966. They established clearly the duties of every state regarding the fundamental human rights for their citizens. They have the duty to respect and they have the duty to ensure. And to ensure for a government means that they need to prevent, trying to avoid that these abuses are committed, that happen, and then if they have been unable to prevent and the abuses have happened, to provide the remedy, to investigate, to prosecute, and to punish the perpetrators, and to provide the reparation for the victims. But this is not what happened in the transitions in the 80s and 90s. Basically, this doctrine of transitional justice was born in Latin America, and as a consequence of the abuses of the military dictatorships in all the region during that time. But at the end of this, the principles of what supposedly as a guideline should be done when every country recovered the democratic situation after a time of dictatorship, of authoritarian regime, of abuses of human rights, were established in the so-called Juanet principle. Juanet was a French magistrate that received the commitment from the United Nations to write these principles, to try to systematize what are these benchmarks, the things that you have to do when you become a democracy. Again, these principles were updated 10 years later, almost 10 years later, by Diane Corell, another professor, in this case from America, and they were approved by ECOSOC, by the Commission of Human Rights, and these 4 pillars of transitional justice are truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence. And justice, as we told, providing an effective remedy and fighting impunity. I am not developing all of them, only the right to justice, and it's establishing clearly the principles concerning the territorial and the extraterritorial and the international jurisdiction to prosecution of international crimes. We are going to the extraterritorial because it was the problem in Argentina and in Chile. And basically, if we use now the wording of the Rome Statute, it is complementarity. Complementarity is about willingness and ability. You have justice if the authorities in a certain territory is willing to provide justice and is able to do it. But what about the situations in which, for political reasons or for lack of capacity, there is not this willingness or this ability? So can the political obstacles in Chile in the 90s be removed in order to the victims get the proper protection of the tribunals? Can the ability be created in countries like, in my experience, for example, Guatemala, when they have not the basic equipment and the training and everything to bring justice, especially against very serious perpetrators? So this is the challenge. Can ability and willingness be built? And can we do something in this global world that we live to help others that have problems of impunity to go beyond this impunity and provide some justice? We were mentioning yesterday like a joke, but it is not a joke. This famous song of the Beatles, I did it, but with a little help of my friends. That's more or less the idea. That's all about this. So we in Spain had these 2 very clear references. First of all, the dictatorship in Argentina, and we were trying to establish a precedent maybe because we have been unable to establish the precedent with our own dictatorship. But the fact is that even if we didn't make ever any difference between victims because of their nationality, there was a very strong argument for the Spanish court and the Spanish public opinion, the fact that in Argentina there were many Spanish victims. And in Chile it was the same. It was not the legal reason, but it was a very persuasive argument when we had to go to court to persuade them to take a case that had happened 25 years ago, more than 12,000 miles away. But this is what happened. So Mr. Videla was, for many reasons, the first candidate. He had been tried in Argentina. He had been convicted to life imprisonment, but the pressure of the militaries had made him released, and he had got pardoned, and he was free. But in Argentina, there were still many claims of justice because victims did not accept this pardon. So this was the challenge for us, humble progressive prosecutors, a minority in a very conservative career in our country, and we needed at least 2 cases. According to Spanish law, to establish a binding precedent, you need a doctrine established by the Supreme Court and at least confirmed once. So we need a binding precedent and we need 2 cases. The first one was Argentina. We created it acting on behalf of the victims as a trade union without any official capacity as prosecutors and without any official support from anywhere. And we had to build a case according to the principles of Nuremberg because it was the precedent we had to use, because it was the one establishing clearly the universal jurisdiction. The enemies of mankind must be prosecuted everywhere, because they have offended not the domestic law or the specific victims of a territory, but they have offended the international law, so they have offended all of us, and we all are the court of justice where they can be and must be brought. But the question is that Spain was not a very good field to play this game, so a turning point was very unlikely in our country. But this is what a Spanish poet says, that justice belongs to the forces of the soul, because it appears in the most unprecedented and unexpected places. And this is what happened in the very conservative Spanish Audiencia Nacional. We got the cases. The tools were these, the Nuremberg principles. It was very clear from 1945, and it was had not been used during 50 years. So the individual criminal responsibility was very clearly established then. The primacy of international law, whatever the domestic law could establish. So no immunities, no amnesties, no due obedience, but a fair trial for everyone. This is a principle still working today, even after the other September 11 in the war of terror. But to build the cases, we needed a link, something that the German Nazis had made, should have been made in Chile and in Argentina in order to establish that the principles applied to the Nazis could be applied to the Argentinians or to the Chileans. And we needed a link. Why we should be able to apply the Nuremberg principles to General Pinochet or General Vidal. And we had to find this link, but the link existed. You probably know all these men, not gentlemen, but men. Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, Hermann Goering, and the link. Our link is Marshal Keitel. Marshal Keitel was the head of the army in Germany during the Second World War. Marshal Keitel legalized forced disappearance. He's the one who made the decree, Nach und Nebel, that established exactly this. In 1941, effective and lasting intimidation can only be achieved whether by capital punishment or by means which leave the relatives of the population in the dark about the fate of the culprit. Deportation to Germany serves this purpose. So, accepting the cases when they need make an example with public executions, Marshal Keitel told all the other opponents should be clandestinely sent to Germany and they will disappear. And the disappearance will paralyze the family members, the political parties, the opposition, the resistance. So this is what we have to do, make people disappear. And it was the link. It was exactly what had happened many years later in Argentina and in Chile. The president for us was very good. It's Marshal Keitel, not anymore a successful general, but a prisoner in Nuremberg. He was tried, he was found guilty. He was convicted and sentenced to death and executed. So this is exactly what happened in Latin America. Nach und Nebel is no name, ningún nombre, is people disappearing, simple as that. And we have 30,000 disappearances in Argentina, and we have 1,200 forced disappearances in Chile. So we had the link. For this, We brought the two cases. It should be too much long to explain all the details, but basically what we did was making the turning point. So removing the political obstacles, making the situation in the own countries, Argentina and Chile, change dramatically, creating the conditions, paving the way for justice being brought where in the first place should have been brought, in Argentina and Chile themselves. The turning point in the case of Argentina were these two humble presidents, but creating the situation in Argentina for the parliament, considering abrogated the laws of amnesty and the decrees of pardon, and starting over all the process of justice for the victims. We were able to arrest, to try and to punish a captain of the Navy in Madrid. He received, Captain Adolfo Estiligo, 600 years of imprisonment on counts of 30 murders. And in Mexico, we were able to arrest, to get an extradition and to put in jail another captain of the Navy. And the situation in less than 2 years had changed so dramatically that we didn't need to try in Spain Captain Cavallo, because we could re-extradite him to Buenos Aires, and he was tried and convicted in Argentina. But the situation, the most important, was General Videla. He was tried again. He received another life imprisonment conviction, and finally he died in prison in 2013. And now come to Chile. In Chile, the situation was the same. There were the same claims of justice. Victims were not satisfied with the situation of amnesty that Pinochet had decreed for himself in 1978. So the people was still claiming there had been more than 3,000 murders, there had been more than 35,000 cases of torture, and the story you already know, the coup d'etat. 1974, Pinochet proclaimed himself head of state. In 1978, granted himself amnesty, and in 1989, he asked two people if they wanted him to continue in the power, and people said no. First time he asked it in 17 years. But still he kept military immunity as commander-in-chief of the army, and then he kept life immunity as member of the parliament, so prosecuting him was not possible in Chile. These are the political obstacles I mentioned. So this made him a kind of paradigm of impunity, because he could not be prosecuted. Simple as that. So this was the challenge. We had to break this immunity, and for this, we sincerely didn't think that it was possible, but it happened. This kind of justice appearing in the most unexpected places and moments. So we found that he was in a clinic called The Clinic in London, not a very original name, but it was the place. We sent a warrant for his arrest, and he was arrested. This is a wonderful thing of this old democracy, that the Scotland Yard said, well, what are you claiming for this person? So, well, for murder. Okay, we usually arrest murderers in London. So you send the order, we will arrest him, and we will send him before a judge. This is what happened. But then immediately he said, I am a head of state, I have immunity. We cannot discuss about this, but it was like a final in soccer championship. We have to go twice before the House of Lords to waive his immunity. It was very difficult because Britain is a country with a very strong transition of immunity of the head of a state, but the Queen has not any kind of capacity of really governing the country. So we have to persuade the Lords, and the first time we won 3-2, like a session of penalties, and the second time it has to be repeated because one of the Lords had been supporting Amnesty International. The second time we won 6-1. So we were improving our performance, and then we kept General Pinochet 500 days in house arrest in London, and finally, we were able to bring before the London court, and this is the important thing, it is one of the most important messages in my view, an overwhelming evidence. This evidence that Juan Guzman was mentioning, the lawyers of the Vicaría de la Solidaridad and other organizations have been gathering evidence for 25 years. They didn't know, they never expected that this information, that this document, that this evidence could be useful anywhere, anytime, but they still insisted doing that. And when we were able to bring Pinochet before a court of justice, the evidence that they had been gathering for a quarter of a century was overwhelming. So we had 40,000 documented cases of torture, telling the name of the victim, the name of the perpetrator, the date, the place, the situation, the conditions. I said, well, this case is not useful, I have another one. You don't like this, I have another one. And another one, and another one, until 40,000. And there is no judge in the world that can decide that it is not important. So we want the extradition. You know that the extradition was interrupted for humanitarian reasons. He came back to Chile, and now is the role of Mr. Guzman, because he was the same old dictator, but Chile was a very new, different country. So he could be indicted, and then we found that he had hidden a lot of money in different tax havens in the US, in the United Kingdom, but in the Bahamas, and in other places. He was indicted also in counts of tax fraud, money laundering, embezzlement, and finally he died. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a ustedes, muchas gracias a la Fundación, a Edelstam, especialmente a Caroline, que me ha distinguido con el honor de estar aquí y hablar junto a una celebridad del mundo de los derechos humanos. Especialmente para mí es muy emotivo.
Thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you to the Edelstam Foundation, to Caroline, to all of you, and for the opportunity to be here to talk to you with so very important celebrities. Thank you. Please go on.
Al juez Guzman, que tiene un lugar especial, yo creo, muchas de las víctimas y de las víctimas sobrevivientes y de las organizaciones de víctimas.
Juan Guzman has a very special role and is a figure extremely important for all the victims and all the organizations in Chile.
Y a nuestro amigo Carlos
Castresana,
que para nosotros le debemos gratitud eterna.
We are thankful forever.
El juez, ex juez, para mí todavía es juez, sigue siendo juez Guzmán, ya habló sobre lo que ocurrió durante la dictadura, las violaciones de derechos humanos de la dictadura chilena.
Juan Guzman already explained about the abuses against human rights during the Chilean dictatorship.
Yo no voy a repetir entonces eso porque son hechos que yo creo que son bastante conocidos.
I am not repeating these facts because they are enough known, widely known.
Chile era hasta 1973 el país, al menos en Sudamérica, el país más democrático.
Chile was until 1973 the most democratic Latin American country.
De acuerdo a todos los observatorios internacionales.
According to all the international standards.
Y en ese país, que podría también, como yo acostumbro a decir, compararse con la Suecia, o podría llamarse la Suecia de Sudamérica.
And this country that could be considered in many ways like the Sweden of Latin America.
En ese país, de la noche a la mañana, se transforma ese país en un infierno.
That country was transformed overnight in hell.
Escenas que nosotros habíamos visto en Chile a través de los medios de comunicación existentes, ocurridas en la Alemania nazi.
We had seen this kind of situations in the movies or in the television, never in Chile, but as a reference from the Nazi Germany.
Y por supuesto en otros lugares también, pero me refiero especialmente a la experiencia nazi.
And in other places too, but we were especially impressed or as a reference taking the case of the Nazi Germany.
Empiezan a hacer el pan de cada día en mi país.
And it began to happen in a daily basis in Chile too.
Y además somos nosotros los que pasamos a ser las víctimas, los perseguidos, los detenidos, los torturados, los asesinados.
And we Chileans begin suddenly to be the victims, those disappeared, tortured, imprisoned.
Un trauma enorme y una tragedia enorme se empieza a escribir en mi país.
It's a terrible page for the history of Chile that began to be written at the time with this situation.
Vecinos que indican a sus vecinos y los entregan a la policía y los llaman. En los lugares de trabajo, lo mismo. Compañeros de trabajo entregan a sus compañeros de trabajo que tenían idea de izquierda, que habían apoyado al gobierno popular.
Neighbors against neighbors, people in factories denouncing their colleagues before the police, and people disappeared.
En las universidades, en los sectores, sobre todo los sectores populares, en los sectores populares, esto también ocurre a diario.
Also in the universities and among the most popular parts of the society, daily.
Y la diferencia, en el caso chileno, con otras dictaduras latinoamericanas, que son muchas en la época moderna.
And the difference in the case of Chile regarding other dictatorships in Latin America at the same time
es lo masivo de la represión.
Is that the repression was widely extended, was massive.
En otros casos de dictaduras sudamericanas, la represión era desde un comienzo selectiva y focalizada.
In other dictatorships in the same region, in the same time, the repression was much more selective.
En el caso chileno fue diferente.
But in the case of Chile, it was a very different thing.
El general ministro del Interior después del golpe, dijo: nosotros sabemos que estamos deteniendo demasiada gente, pero no podemos correr el riesgo de que los culpables o los responsables de haber creado el caos en Chile vayan libres.
The general in charge of the Ministry of Interior in the military junta immediately after the coup said once in public, we know that we are maybe arresting too much people, but we cannot take the risk of letting some of the responsibles of the previous regime to go free.
¿Por qué detener a un grupo acá solamente si puedo detener a todos? Y después, mediante la tortura, podré saber quiénes son los verdaderos culpables.
Why arresting only a few if we can arrest all of them, and then interrogating and torturing them, we can find out the real responsibles of the situation we want to put an end.
Y el clima de terror es naturalmente, realmente aplastante para la población en general.
And the terror is extended all along the population, with all the civilian population.
Un sector, naturalmente, de chilenos celebraba el triunfo de la llegada de la dictadura.
Has to be told that the part of the Chilean society was celebrating, was supporting the dictatorship.
Pero en los sectores populares se empezaba ya a llorar a los detenidos, algunos ya asesinados, etcétera, etcétera.
But in the most popular sectors of the society, they were mourning those who had died, those who disappeared.
Y como la represión era tan masiva, entonces la dictadura tuvo que habilitar no solamente las cárceles que quedaron chicas y los centros de policía y del ejército, sino que, por ejemplo, arenas deportivas, estadios deportivos como el Estadio Nacional de Chile.
So the repression was so much massive that it was not enough. The usual centers of detention, the police stations of the military compounds, but had to be habilitated enormous places like the stadiums.
No fue el único recinto deportivo habilitado como campo de concentración y tortura, por supuesto, pero el más conocido internacionalmente.
The National Stadium is the case most widely known as a concentrating camp, but it is not the only one.
No existe otro campo de concentración después de la Alemania nazi que sea tan grande como el Estadio Nacional. De lo que se tenga memoria.
There is not any known concentrating camp as big as National Stadium after those in the Second World War from the Nazi Germany.
Aquí hay un pequeño acápite sobre las cifras. Cuando hablamos de víctimas, siempre hay que tener mucho cuidado con las cifras. Detrás de cada persona, de cada víctima, hay un drama, una tragedia. Y hay que tener mucho cuidado con las cifras.
Now we need to take into consideration the numbers, because even if every case individually considered is enormously important, the numbers are very important too.
En nombre de la verdad y la justicia, además.
Making honor to truth and justice.
No fuimos 40.000 los torturados y detenidos en Chile durante la dictadura. Probablemente sobre 150.000, de acuerdo a las consideraciones que hacen los organismos de derechos humanos en Chile.
According to the human rights organizations, there were many more than these 40,000 allegedly tortured, but probably more than 150,000.
Esta cifra que se repite de los 40.000 torturados o prisioneros en Chile, que se refiere al llamado informe Walsh, al llamado informe sobre la tortura en Chile, que de la Comisión Walsh, 30 años después del golpe militar, cuando ya mucha gente había muerto, fallecido y otros por distintas razones no declararon.
The number of 40,000 comes from the report of Walsh, one of the truth commissions investigating the cases of torture, and this number was established 30 years after the facts.
35.000 en realidad, no 40, 35.000, pero es más o menos lo mismo. Yo soy uno de los que presenté el testimonio ante la comisión Walsh. En el caso mío, que es el caso de muchos, yo fui detenido cerca de mi lugar de trabajo, en Santiago. Fui llevado a una comisaría policial en Chile.
Now he is speaking about himself. He is one of those who came to give the testimony before the PALEC, the Truth Commission, establishing his case. And his case is that he was arrested in Santiago and brought, first of all, to a police station.
Yo empecé a ser torturado en esa estación de policía.
He was tortured there in the police station,
junto con otros compañeros.
With other detainees.
De ahí llevado al Estadio Nacional de Santiago de Chile.
From then he was transported to the National Stadium in Santiago.
Uno de los dirigentes de la Fundación Edelstam, aquí presente, Henry, estuvo en el Estadio Nacional también.
One of the founders of the Edelstam Foundation, Henry Jambel, was also a prisoner in the National Stadium.
Solamente en el Estadio Nacional pueden haber pasado entre 30 y 40.000 prisioneros.
The estimations are, you cannot never be sure because there are not official numbers, but the estimations are that 40,000 people were prisoners in the National Stadium.
En el camino al Estadio Nacional, a medianoche, después de haber sufrido ya torturas, sufro, junto con mis compañeros, el primer simulacro de fusilamiento.
During our transportation from the police station to the National Stadium, I was victim of the first attempted or fake shooting,
simulacro.
Yes, an attempt. No, yes, an attempt.
Simulera.
Shooting.
Después vendrían otros. Y en el Estadio Nacional, al llegar al Estadio Nacional, el espectáculo era, de no creerlo, era como una película de horror.
Upon arrival to the National Stadium, the scenario was like a terror movie.
Para mí y para muchos otros fue un choque muy grande llegar a ese estadio en esas condiciones.
Arriving to the stadium in those conditions was a terrible shock.
Ese era el estadio de todos los chilenos, el estadio del Estado de Chile, el estadio donde iban a jugar el fútbol. Es un recinto muy grande, no solamente con canchas de fútbol.
It's a very big stadium and very well known as a place for games and sportive events.
Un orgullo de Chile en el terreno deportivo.
A place that was a pride for all the Chileans.
Ahí fui con mi padre, siendo chico, iba a ver fútbol naturalmente, nuestro deporte favorito.
I had been there with my father when I was a boy.
Tenía recuerdos muy lindos de ese estadio.
And I had a very good souvenir of the place.
Sí. Y ahí, en ese estadio, caer en esas condiciones, ser torturado y estar entre la vida y la muerte, fue un choque muy grande y, por supuesto, dejó heridas que son prácticamente incurables.
So this place that I associated in my memory like something to enjoy, like a sportive place when I was there with my father, and showing this transformed in a center of torture is a very shocking experience.
Esa es la experiencia muy resumida. En mi infierno sigue por un segundo campo de concentración en el desierto de Atacama, en Chacabuco, en el norte de Chile.
After that, I was sent to another concentrating camp, another center of torture in Chacabuco, in the northern, in the area of Atacama, which is a desert.
Permanezco un año hasta que soy trasladado a un tercer campo de concentración.
And after one more year, I am transported to another concentrating camp.
Estando allí, de ahí soy trasladado a un cuarto campo de concentración.
To a fourth one, which is Santiago.
Y estando ahí, después soy sacado a la fuerza en enero de 1975.
And then in January of 1975,
soy sacado a la fuerza al aeropuerto y expulsado de por vida de Chile.
I am sent to the airport and expelled forever from my own country.
Gracias a la solidaridad internacional, entre otras, de Suecia.
And I survived thanks to the solidarity, especially from Sweden.
Para terminar, dos cosas que pueden servir para nuestro debate o conversación posterior.
I have to add two things for our discussion later.
No olvidar quiénes son los responsables del golpe cívico-militar en mi país.
Never forget who are the responsibles of the civil military coup in my country.
Está muy documentado con miles y miles de documentos que los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica planificó y llevó a efecto junto con sus contactos en Chile, militares y civiles, el baño de sangre que sufrió mi país.
It is clearly documented that the government of the U.S. was part of the coup, of the organization and execution of the coup d'etat.
Los jefes de tortura en mi país fueron entrenados todos en la Escuela de las Américas.
The Chilean responsibles of torture had been trained in the School of Americas from the United States.
Esa escuela se llama en Latinoamérica, en voz popular, Escuela de Asesinos o Escuela de Torturadores.
This School of Americas is widely known in Latin America like a School of Torturer or School of Assassins.
Por desgracia, Suecia mantiene relaciones con esa escuela.
Sweden has a relationship with this school.
Eso es una de las cosas que es interesante discutir, que es un asunto sensible, delicado y que tiene que ver con un poco lo que Carlos planteaba.
This, I think, it is an important point that has to be discussed here in Sweden.
Aquí hay una diferencia, cuando Carlos mostraba, entre lo que se dice, lo que se establece en las convenciones internacionales, sobre todo, por ejemplo, cuando se trata de crímenes de lesa humanidad, y lo que ocurre después en la práctica. ¿Qué decimos y qué hacemos?
Yes, there is a huge difference between what is established in the international conventions or in the agreements among the states and the real life, what happens after that. So we don't fulfill what we supposedly accept to do.
Y esa es también, y son los actores que salvaron a Augusto Pinochet de haber sido juzgado como el criminal que es, además de categoría internacional.
And those are the same responsibles of avoiding Augusto Pinochet to having been tried.
Hubo silencio en muchas partes cuando Pinochet fue prisionero en Londres.
There was silence in many places when Pinochet was arrested in London.
Y ese silencio nos duele mucho a nosotros.
And this silence is very painful for us.
Desgraciadamente fueron muchos los que quisieron que Pinochet no fuera preso, sino que fuera libre.
Those were many who didn't want Pinochet to be tried, but wanted him set free.
Empezando por 3 países que se consideran democráticos.
And 3 countries have to be mentioned.
Hablo de los gobiernos de los 3 países. Chile,
The
España,
government of Chile,
España
Spain,
e Inglaterra.
and United Kingdom.
Y un acuerdo político permitió que estuviera libre.
And a political agreement permitted him to be free.
Eso es impunidad.
And this is impunity.
Y por eso vamos a luchar.
And we are continuing fighting.
Para terminar mi parte solamente, digo, como acostumbro a decir, yo escribí este libro, que es el libro que se ha mencionado acá, es el único testimonio que existe en idioma sueco, de alguien que haya sobrevivido campos de concentración en Latinoamérica, acá en Suecia. Lo escribí justamente para honrar a mis compañeros muertos y desaparecidos que han sido mencionados por el juez Guzman.
He wrote this book. It is the only testimony in Swedish language about what happened in Chile, and he wrote it like homage to his colleagues that were unfortunately disappeared or died in the repression in Chile.
Cuando yo supe que había sobrevivido, yo dije que iba a dedicar el resto de mi vida, gran parte del resto de mi vida, a honrar a mis compañeros.
When he survived, he decided to dedicate the rest of his life to honor his companions.
You are most welcome.
Chair, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor for me, good morning, to say good morning to you and to be here. I understand we have about half an hour to our disposal. Let's start again by a quick glimpse at the rear view mirror. As we just were reminded, the 20th century included essential democratic and technical progress, but it also included the 2 world wars. Moreover, even besides the wars, it was a period of ongoing terror, killing millions of people. A few examples. I think of the colonial persecution of entire populations in Africa, not least in the Congo. A more private experience. In 1911, the Italians invaded Libya, forcing many, also my own mother and her family, to flee Tripoli. In 1915, we all know, took place a terrible action in the Ottoman Empire against 1 million Armenians and other Christians. When Italy afterwards became fascist, it organized concentration camps and mass murdering in eastern Libya, where about 50% of the population was killed. 50%. This is not so well known. Of course, you all remember Nazi Germany's extermination of 6 million Jews. And also remember that in the USSR, millions so-called enemies of the people were killed. More recently, Pol Pot did so in Cambodia. We were just reminded about the terror in different countries in Latin America under different dictatorships. In the 90s, genocide took place in former Yugoslavia and also in Rwanda. This is history, but it says, as we all know, history tends to repeat itself. The question raised at this seminar is what can be done to hinder it. In an inquiry a few years ago, people in exposed positions due to conflicts or persecution or poverty were asked about their wishes for the future. Their first priority turned out to be justice. In other words, justice must be done and seen to be done. So besides material and political support, justice is an indispensable piece of process of reparation after any conflict. Of course, the start must be a collective peace and reconciliation, but I would like to warn against demands for individual reconciliation. Such demands tend to include demands for forgiveness by the survivor. Experience shows that this can do serious mental harm and come to suffering for the involved victims. Let me turn back to Rwanda in 1994. The genocide there is, as I see it, a pivotal example of what can happen when the international community is paralyzed. Early in the morning of the 7th of April 1994, a few hours after the crash of a plane carrying the presidents of Rwanda and of Burundi in Kigali, it had been shot down by a cannon, by a so far unknown person. Anyhow, the Rwandan army, supported by youth militia, started a mass slaughter of civilians, mainly from a minority group called Tutsis, in the propaganda so-called cockroaches. The following days, massacres spread from Kigali throughout Rwanda. And in short time, the ancient so-called land of 1,000 hills were turned into hell on earth. Roadblocks were erected, thousands of people, identified by their ID cards, were taken away to be shot or hacked to death. Mass killings also occurred in places of refuge, such as churches, hospitals, schools. Others, identified by pre-prepared death rolls, were butchered in their homes and villages. Women were raped, made pregnant, and contaminated with HIV. Small girls were also raped, after which many of them were drowned in latrines alive and all put into mass graves. Clearly, these killings had been meticulously planned, and the idea of it was an African copy of what the Nazi so-called final solution. The Rwandan, those who were responsible for all this in Rwanda, spoke of the finally solving the Tutsi problem. In other words, to exterminate the country's Tutsi minority. And after 100 days, one of the worst genocides ever had been carried out, killing about 1 million people. Many, of course, afterwards also suffered long-time physical and mental injuries. Now it's well known the fact that the United Nations failed to take the actions needed to prevent or stop this genocide. There is an official report also presented to the Security Council by an independent inquiry chaired by former Swedish Prime Minister Corell. It says that despite the availability of information, a combination of internal malfunctioning and national interventionism and protectionism paralyzed the UN and made it of little utility in the face of a genocide. In other words, the UN was not prepared enough for this kind of situation, with a very clear need to adequately intervene. In brief, a lack of political will resulted in helplessness. However, a few months after the events, in November 1994, in order to bring those responsible for the massacres to justice, the Security Council set up a special tribunal in Rwanda. It was organized partially in common with the Yugoslavia Tribunal, and its statute was drafted under direction by Corell, who is here present now, our chair today. This new tribunal was given the power to prosecute persons responsible for serious violations of international humanitarian law, genocide and crimes against humanity. We understood there that it was envisioned that it should concentrate its efforts on bringing to court the big fish, in other words, the architects behind the genocide. The General Assembly elected me one of the judges at this tribunal. Our first judgment came in 1998, and there we call genocide the crime of crimes. Amongst other things, we bring it out that it can be committed also by rape and sexual violence. And this judgment is the first ever applying the 1948 UN Convention on Genocide. It's still considered by experts on international criminal law to be the leading precedent so far. Making the Rwanda genocide its starting point, an international commission in Canada in 2001 presented a report on measures to meet massacres, serious and systematic violations of human rights. And one of the findings was to emphasize that the UN member states have a general responsibility to protect people from avoidable catastrophe and from mass murder or rape and from starvation. The abbreviation of this responsibility of protect is R2P. When it comes to the need of early warning, the International Commission notes, I quote, "It is possible to exaggerate the extent of which lack of early warning is a serious problem in government and intergovernmental organizations these days. More often than not, what is lacking is not the basic data, but is analysis and translation into political prescription and the will to do something about it. Far often, and this recent report on UN response in Rwanda in 1994 confirmed this, lack of early warning is an excuse, rather than an explanation. And the problem is not lack of warning, but of timely response. At the 2004 Stockholm International Forum, chaired by Prime Minister Göran Persson, this idea was developed by UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. He presented there a special system to keep the Security Council better informed of such violations and threats to international peace and security. Some say now it's perhaps necessary now to try and make that system even more efficient. In addition, we heard about that already from the previous speakers, but in addition, let me remind you that already under the Rome Statute of 1998, every state has, quote, the duty to exercise its criminal jurisdiction over those responsible for international crimes, unquote. That is, international crimes, they mean genocide, crime against humanity, and war crimes. Chair, we are all aware that in different ways states can turn to UN organs, such as the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and the Human Rights Council. Moreover, European countries, like Sweden, can also activate the European Union and the Council of Europe. Civil society plays also an important role here, and it includes well-established NGOs such as the Red Cross, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, Médecins Sans Frontières, and many others. Yet, and this is my final finding, despite shortcomings by the United Nations and its Security Council, the present situation in countries like Syria and Iraq, and also in Africa, again shows us there is no valid and lasting security solution outside the United Nations. We all depend on UN, and UN is, and is bound to be, dependent of its member states and their political will. Thank you for listening.
Yes. Let me say first that on the final note here with the United Nations, it is so important that the UN fulfills its obligations. And we should remember that the UN Charter was written by a generation that had experienced 2 world wars. And if the members of the organization followed the charter, it would be a formidable organization. The problem is that they don't always do that. And in some instances, even Western democracies violate the charter. Like, for example, when the UK and the United States of America attacked Iraq back in 2003. And then we have Russia attacking Georgia, 2008, and now the latest in Ukraine. And I mean, if the permanent members of the Security Council do not bow to the law that they are actually set to supervise, where are we heading then? But let us go back to the laureate here and congratulate once more Judge Juan Guzman to the Edelstam Prize. And I think we'll listen with great respect to your presentation here. And I think my first question to you would be concerning something that might surprise at least a Swede, namely the fact that the judge acts as investigator and also prosecutor and a judge. Could you just briefly touch on that point? Yes. Thank you. And I think we have to speak up so the audience can hear us. Thank you.
Is there a microphone here?
No.
There is no microphone. This is a problem. So just be seated and just have a couple of comments on this. Maybe.
You're going to be surprised because we ourselves, the Chilean, especially Chilean lawyers, are surprised of our procedural law in criminal matters for more than 100 years. Our Código de Procedimiento Penal, our statute of criminal procedural law, was a copy of the Spanish law at the end of the 19th century. And we had, now things have changed. But since the beginning of the 20th century up to 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, more or less, we had, I will ask, I prefer to
we are in the panel, so we have to see to it that we can save as much time as possible for the other members of the audience also.
Is it possible to be seen from everywhere?
Yes.
Please.
For you,
No. We have to think that there are several panelists and the audience, so we have to. This is a panel discussion, so it's not another lecture. Thank you.
okay. Well, it's very short.
Yeah.
In a normal accusatory system, there are, in criminal affairs, two parties. The party that has to do with the state, the kingdom, or the people. And the other party is the defendant and the lawyers who defend the defendant. In our system, we had one judge who did the investigation in a part of the procedure that was called summary, the first part of the criminal trial. We even said trial when it was not yet a trial, but things were so confusing that it made us have to act with fewer words in order to understand what was happening. Even the defendants didn't know what was happening because it was a real inquisition to which they were submitted. The first part of the criminal trial in Chile, was the sumario. The sumario belonged to the judge. He investigated with enormous power. And once he had sufficient evidence regarding the crime and the authors of the crime, I'm not going to speak about all the participants, author, accomplice, cover-ups. I'll just speak about the authors generically. When there was enough evidence, then the judge, the same judge, indicted the defendant, and if there were more evidence, they would be added to what was already obtained, and the same judge accused. Here he indicted, here he accused, with a little bit more evidence, and here...
Yes, but then when you come to the judgment, is it the same judge that passes the judgment?
Yes, it's exactly the same
because
judge.
I think this is what we think is extraordinary, that the same judge, because any judge, had he been near the investigation, would be disqualified from participating in the sentencing.
Absolutely.
So this is a rather extraordinary system.
It's bizarre.
No.
Bizarre. It's like
Well, but I think that you have explained to us what this is about. But I think you said to me yesterday or the other day that this was the system in Chile in those days.
Yes.
But this has now been changed.
It's changed.
Yes.
It's absolutely changed.
Yes.
Now we try according to the rule of law, international rule of law.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any questions from the Carlos, in your case, you made a reference to the Nuremberg principles. You saw them on the screen, the 6 principles. They are the outcome of the Nuremberg trial. And I was invited to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Nuremberg trial, the military court in Nuremberg, now in September this year. They handed down the judgment there. And I think this was a step forward. It was actually a milestone in international criminal justice. But then you explained several elements here. For you, were the Nuremberg principles very important in your thinking when you started working on the Pinochet case, and also in your duty as a prosecutor at large?
Absolutely, yes. They were important at the time, they are important still today. There is not a precedent of effective and fair, in general terms, international justice better than Nuremberg, in my view. They were able to do everything with the most important defendants in less than 6 months, and it's a precedent. And from the legal point of view, the principles of Nuremberg are inside the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So these same principles are still like the Bible of international criminal law.
Mm. But still today, a sitting head of state or a high official would be immune from jurisdiction at the national level. We had the case from the International Court of Justice concerning Belgium and an African state, where we have an obiter dictum by one of the judges, Rosalind Higgins, who said, yes, it's immunity in this particular case, but it's a completely different situation if it is an international court that is seeking the person.
Yes, this is the Herodia case. It was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Democratic Republic of Congo. He was indicted in Belgium court. And then Congo sued Belgium before the International Court of Justice, and it was a question of conflict of sovereignty. A country is not over another country, so the maximum authority, those representatives of the state, who are usually the head of the state and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, are immune to any other domestic jurisdiction in the world, because no other domestic jurisdiction can have more authority than the authorities of their own country. It is a different thing when it is an international court. So the international court, according to the principles of Nuremberg, have primacy over domestic law and jurisdiction. So basically this is the question. For the case of Pinochet, if he had been acting head of state, he could not have been tried other than in Chile or by an international court.
Precisely.
He was a former head of state, so he was not the head of state anymore. And this was the discussion in the House of Lords, basically. Okay, he was not head of state, so he had not immunity at the time, but the question was if his acts, while he had been the head of state, were still protected by the immunity, and this is what the Lords finally decided, that torture could not be considered an act of state, so could never be protected by the immunity for what you did on behalf of your state. And torture is never something that you can do on behalf of a state.
Now this is so important. And I mean, these are steps, and this is how law develops over the years, that step by step it develops, and now we have a very clear signal from a national jurisdiction that a former head of state or a former high official is not protected from this.
This is because the Pinochet case is a huge precedent, and will continue being for the years to come.
Mr. Contreras, no hablo español.
No,
Very sad, but you understand English, I'm sure. But I would like to ask you, when you hear this discussion here, and in view of your personal experience here, what are your reflections for the future? Do you think that there is a chance that what has happened over the last few years will actually mean that there will be a difference, including with the support of the International Criminal Court, where the Nuremberg principles are translated in its charter now?
¿Cuál es su percepción personal sobre la experiencia de estos años y si los precedentes y lo que ha venido pasando pueden representar un cambio para el futuro?
Yo soy bastante optimista siempre, por eso que estoy sentado acá y sigo trabajando.
He is here because he is naturally optimistic.
Pero la realidad, por desgracia, es terrible.
But the reality is not that good. It's pretty terrible.
Según Amnesty International, se tortura en la mayor cantidad de países que están adscritos a las Naciones Unidas, al sistema de Naciones Unidas.
According to Amnesty International, torture is practiced in most of countries, even members of the United Nations.
A pesar de que tenemos más de 30 años una convención internacional que declara la tortura como un crimen de lesa humanidad, la Naciones Unidas, que hay una convención internacional.
Even if the Convention Against Torture is already more than 30 years old,
Se sigue torturando, incluso en los países llamados democráticos.
torture is still a regular practice even in democratic countries.
En nombre de la democracia y la libertad, incluso.
In name or supposedly on behalf of freedom and democracy.
Entonces, cuando nosotros sobrevivientes pensamos nuestra experiencia, cuando yo la pienso,
So when the survivor thinks about our own experience,
pienso lo mismo que pensaba después de salir de la cámara de tortura.
I have the same thoughts that I had just when I had just left the torture chamber.
Este es un crimen monstruoso, muy grande. No puede quedar impune.
This is an egregious crime, cannot go unpunished.
Y entonces, la lección que se saca es que parece que no importa seguir torturando, aunque haya convenciones internacionales, hay una impunidad internacional, por supuesto, donde las potencias mundiales son las responsables, mayores, pero no son las únicas.
Then the message of impunity is torture is permitted. You can continue doing it and nothing will happen.
This is very, very serious. And if I may say so, you know that Senator Feinstein delivered the report to the Senate in the United States of America, clearly indicating that US agencies had engaged in torture. And there is no independent prosecutor to start an investigation in the US. And as you know, Article 12 of the Torture Convention contains a provision that said that the slightest suspicion of torture in the country, there is an obligation to start investigating. So thank you for raising that question.
Que él considera efectivamente un escándalo que el informe oficial de lo que ha pasado en Montana y otros sitios de Estados Unidos indica que las autoridades o los oficiales en Estados Unidos han cometido tortura y que a pesar de eso no ha habido ni una sola investigación oficial.
And also Sweden fell in the trap. We fell in the trap. We delivered 2 persons to CIA that were flown to Cairo and they were tortured in Egypt. And we've been criticized both by the Torture Committee and the Human Rights Committee.
Incluso Suecia cayó en la trampa y le entregó 2 personas a la CIA, que fueron después, que fueron después torturados.
En 1990, cuando se considera que empieza la democracia en Chile, la nueva democracia, después de 1990, no pasa nada desde el punto de vista de los derechos humanos, no pasa mucho. Hay un informe de la verdad llamado informe Laureate en Chile. Eso es lo que...
In 1990, when democracy was restored in Chile, there was just a truth commission, but nothing else.
Ese informe es prácticamente clandestino en Chile. Ahora quizás hay gente que lo conozca, pero durante muchos años era desconocido en las escuelas, universidades, etc. No se conocía prácticamente.
This report of the Truth Commission, the first Truth Commission, the report RETIS, as it's so called, was for many, many years unknown in Chile.
Ese informe documentaba solamente los 3.200 casi casos de asesinados o desaparecidos. Esas eran las víctimas de acuerdo al Estado chileno.
This report referred only to the 3,000 cases of murder.
Todos los torturados no existieron, no era porque
There was not a
no estaban
reference
funcionando.
to the many thousands of cases of torture.
Tuvo que pasar el aporte de Carlos, tuvo que ocurrir el caso Pinochet para que cambiaran las cosas en Chile.
Only after the Pinochet case, things began to change in Chile.
Y entonces se obligó al informe sobre la tortura en Chile del año 2003.
Then it was a second Truth Commission dealing with torture specifically. And it's the
Ahí pasamos a ser víctimas.
So it's the RETIC report, and then 10 years, 12 years later, the BALEC report.
Thank you. Then let us begin. Listen to you, Rwanda. My recollection is the following. I joined the UN on the 6th of March 94. On the 6th of April, the plane went down in Kigali, and as you said, the genocide started. What I never forget is Boutros Ghali's desperate plea for 3,500 paratroopers. The military experts said that would stop the genocide. No state was prepared to contribute these troops, and then it happened. What are your personal reflections here?
It's very true, and maybe also remember that Sweden also was one of the countries which did not really take this seriously enough to send troops. Rwanda was considered to be remote, small, and of less interest, obviously. So Sweden has not always been active under its fine principles of defending human rights everywhere. Another example is that, you know, that we have this, you know very well, that we have a UN International Convention against torture. I was speaking since you spoke about torture. You also know that one of those who fought for this convention to be accepted by the UN was your predecessor, Hans Yes. Now, strangely enough, we don't have any special active law in Sweden against torture. But on the other hand, we have now a proposal for it. And I heard from the Ministry of Justice that the Minister of Justice these days is considering to prepare a bill out from this proposal.
You have listened to your presentations, the four of you. Is there any one of you who has a question to the other panelists about something that was said here? Well, I think also it's important to allow the audience to put questions to the panel when we have the benefit of the panelists' presence here. So if there is a question, please speak up and also state your name. I think you were first and you will come.
Yes, my name is Ellis Wallner. One reflection, I think Mr. Contreras said that the report was unknown at the universities and so on. Now, I come from the United States. I'm born the same year as Mr. Guzman and began primary school in 1945 at the age of 6. I went to good schools. I went to a good high school. I went to Cornell University. I was very interested in history, politics, and so on. I had never heard of the internment of the Japanese Americans, both Japanese and American citizens. Half were half, and didn't learn about that for many years afterwards. Every country has its crimes against its own citizens, whether it's sterilization in Sweden or extraditing or allowing the rendition of those 2 Egyptians, and it's covered up. So I think what is really needed is to expose our own situation in a good way, because that was not taught, it's not taught today in the schools. But Americans don't know about that internment during World War II. I wanted to ask you a question also. You talked about the School of the Americas. It's so notorious, and yet no one knows about it. And you said there was a link to Sweden, and I'm very curious about that. Is Sweden now committing other crimes by being involved with this torture institution in Georgia?
Y le he preguntado que, bueno, primero ha dicho que todos los países esconden parte de su historia,
Sí, eso
es
sí,
criminal,
sí.
obviamente en el caso de Estados Unidos, el internamiento de ciudadanos americanos de origen japonés durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial, pero la pregunta es que le haya llamado la atención, usted ha mencionado que Suecia también en cierta medida ha estado vinculada a la Escuela de las Américas, y le pregunta si puede detallar en qué consiste esa vinculación.
Hace unos años, hace pocos años, yo fui invitado a un debate en la Televisión Nacional de Suecia, donde se mostraba un documental sobre la Escuela de las Américas.
A few years ago, he was invited to the broadcasting television program in Sweden when a documentary about the School of Americas was shown.
El documental, por supuesto, contaba, o sea, resumía todas las barbaridades que se enseñan en las Escuelas de las Américas.
The documentary explained all the terrible things about the School of Americas, and the teaching.
La Televisión Nacional de Suecia invitó a 2 personas a comentar y a discutir sobre el documental. Un representante de las Fuerzas Armadas de la Defensa, de la Escuela Superior de Defensa de Suecia, y
There were 2 guests to discuss this documentary. One of them was a representative of the military academy in Sweden,
y a mí.
and the other one himself.
Fuimos los 2 invitados. Esa discusión fue muy desagradable para el representante de las Fuerzas Armadas de Suecia.
The discussion was very disgusting for the representative of the Swedish Armed Forces.
Porque cuando la Televisión Nacional de Suecia le dijo que tenían información fidedigna de la colaboración de Suecia con las Escuelas de las Américas, él no la pudo negar, la reconoció.
Because in the program was arousing the information that there was a relationship between the armed forces of Sweden and the School of Americas, and this representative of the army could not deny.
Entonces yo le dije a él, que cómo era posible que un país como Suecia, que hablara sobre los derechos humanos y en los foros internacionales, que fuera la voz de los derechos humanos, al mismo tiempo colaborara con una escuela de torturadores y asesinos. Y ahí...
Then he told to this representative of the armed forces that in his opinion it was unacceptable that a democratic country like Sweden, respectful of human rights, could have a relationship with this.
La respuesta fue lo de siempre, volvemos a lo siempre. Sí, pero es que resulta que las relaciones, etc.
The response was washy-washy.
Yeah,
but
you got an answer there, and of course your recollection of the Japanese incursion in the US. There's now a very moving monument in Washington, just near the statue of William Taft, I think.
It took about 40 years before there was any recognition of what those people said.
Exactly, but then the recognition came. I think you were next.
Yeah, my question is about vulnerable. My name is Laureate. My question is about special vulnerable population, and the question is towards the Judge Guzman. If you think there will be any proper reparation for those that were children and subject to prison and torture during the dictatorship, because as I'm in the list of ex-minor, and we haven't received the same reparations. So I'm wondering how come when children are considered special vulnerable population in international conventions and subject of special protection.
Are you, thank you. Does your question, is it directed to the mothers who were waiting for children, or for the children that saw atrocities?
Children that were imprisoned together with their mothers or fathers and were subject to witness amongst others.
There's nothing written in that matter. There was a second report of atrocities that was in 2003. Yes, 2003. That report didn't distinguish whether the people who were tortured were present during torture were children or not. It was just global, So no, it was too quick. It was done very quickly, and it has nothing, no distinction, as I said, between adults and children.
And it will not be, do you not see that in the future that will be reconsidered, considering that those children were?
I don't have any information. What I think is the same as you, that it's atrocious. The children supported that, their lives changed. They had sad lives with no future, really. And, well, no, I don't have any notion about that.
Yeah. Yes, please.
I was wondering what you, my name is Lisa Berg. I was wondering what you think about the future of the International Criminal Court, how to restore the trust, because it is attacked from, by different arguments, and some countries are trying to leave the court now, to leave their own statutes. So how do you look upon the future? Because I think it's a very important court, as we have been talking about international justice and universal justice, but I think we have to restore it somehow. So that's my question.
Well, if it's put to the panel, maybe I ask, since I was involved in establishment of all the international criminal tribunals there are, except the one in Lebanon, and I was the Secretary General's representative at the Rome Conference in 1998. And it's very, very serious here. I mean, the court has not succeeded the way I had hoped, but at the same time, states have to support the court. And the fact that, for example, states have allowed the President of Sudan to visit other states in Africa without extraditing to the court is unacceptable. And now South Africa has signaled that they want to leave the court, and also other states in Africa. Let me answer your question by quoting Kofi Annan. He was giving a lecture in South Africa in 2013 and was asked by the audience, what is your opinion about heads of states now sitting in Addis Ababa in the African Union discussing withdrawing from the ICC? He said, those heads of state and government deserve a badge of shame. And let's hope that states understand that they have to support the court. Maybe someone else has something to add here on this.
Well, we could only add that there are several reasons why the ICC has not really succeeded, but of course there is also the reason that they are not supported by all nations. And the fact that they are not supportive of all nations is very much the result of the policy of the United States.
Yes.
So, because they have influence on other states who were depending, for instance, of support from the United States economically, and told them that if you don't, if you accept the ICC, you won't have any money. So that was a very efficient way of working. Now we all hope that during the former president of the United States, they would maybe change and become a member of the ICC. After the result of the elections in USA lately, I like many others, I become more pessimistic about the possibilities.
Yes.
Nothing is impossible, but I'm pessimistic.
But it's a need for constant work here, also by civil society, to bring states on board here, because this is the only way ahead, if I say so. Someone else in the audience? Yes, absolutely.
I think that there are two different questions that are failing in the International Criminal Court. One is the performance of the court itself, and mainly the office of the prosecutor. That is true, has not been fair selecting the cases and not balancing the different situations. Maybe most of the situations are in Africa, we understand that, and not all the perpetrators are Africans. So you can take the Democratic Republic of Congo and indict not only African warlords, but also Eastern European arms traffickers or Western European businessmen dealing with natural resources smuggled from conflict areas. So it could be a good idea to improve the reliability and the trust of the court. And secondly, the Assembly of State Parties. So we cannot wait until the US or Russia or India or Pakistan help the court. They will not do it for a long, long time, but the commitment of the member states should be much stronger. There is not acceptable the situation of the court launching a warrant for the arrest of Omar al-Bashir, and not only the African countries, but the rest of the countries that are more than 120, telling nothing, absolutely nothing, and not providing the support to the court, because the court is a big engine without wheels. The wheels are the states. So if you have an engine working without wheels, the car will go nowhere. So basically this is a problem. We have a problem in the engine and we have a problem in the wheels.
I agree very much with what you are saying about the ICC, but I would also stress one thing you said, and that is this is the responsibility of the prosecutor. What can judges do without having indictments, without having any trials? They can't do anything. And I know personally that many of the judges there are not at all satisfied with the situation, but they feel they don't have the power to do much about it. Let's hope now that the new prosecutor will do a better job and come up with trials, for instance, on genocide, and not only face people in Africa, but also in other parts of the world. Because I saw a book recently published by Philip Sands, where he said he had a long list of countries where he was working with different cases of people who were suspect of having committing genocide. I think he had 15 or 20 different countries all over the world, not only in Africa at all over the world. So there are cases. The reality is not at all that we don't have any genocides or any crimes against humanity in the world. That's not the fact. The problem is that we have no trials and not one single judgment by the ICC on genocide. Not one, so far.
No, and I think this is very serious, and I don't want to prolong the discussion on this point too much, but if you're interested, I have an article on my website, just Google my name, under the title Challenges for the International Criminal Court, where I have addressed some of these issues, and also I think it's very important to have professional judges on the court, and they have a list B, where professors and people who've never set foot in a courtroom can be elected as judges to this court. I think such a complicated court, you need people who can hit the ground running when they come to the court, and they should have experience from courtrooms. Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
I have two questions going up. Jennifer Schmidt, sorry. Two questions, if I may. The first one is, if you said people want justice above all, and but when you're negotiating a peace agreement, to be able to bring some of the parties to the table, you have to provide them amnesty, otherwise they won't come. So my first question is, how do you deal with these situations where you're in a very volatile state and you need to achieve peace before you can achieve justice, or at least some people claim that? My second question relate to the terrorist attacks that we've seen lately, in particular in France, and the erosion of human rights that is happening around the world right now, and how we can work preventively with that.
Thank you.
The first question, we'll take the first, is one of the most difficult parts of, let's say, the new international law, which is transitional justice. Yes, it's trying to combine sometimes values that seem to be in contradiction, and all of them are important. So how you can get peace in Colombia without ignoring justice, or what kind of justice is possible in the framework of a peace agreement with a guerrilla group. Justice is not only retributive justice, can be also restorative justice. It's not an easy question, so we are just trying to find the responses to this question you made, that is really difficult, and this is probably an evolution that we will see in the coming years. But obviously there must be an effort must be made in order to make coherent and compatible these values, like putting end to an armed conflict, and at the same time that it do not represent impunity and an added offense to victims.
And the other question? Who would like to? Well, if I may then, I think it's a very, very serious situation we have here. And in my view, the root causes, or the IS, that has generated these terrorist attacks, the root causes, the seed to ISIS, was sown by the United States of America and the United Kingdom when they attacked Iraq back in 2003. And I was among the Under-Secretaries General that Kofi Annan brought with him when the 15 ambassadors of the Security Council came to see me the day after the attack, asking his advice. I never forget that morning. And when you go in and occupy a country, throw out a political party, the Ba'ath Party and the Sunnis, and then allow the Shias to instill themselves, and have a government that is actually protecting only part of the population, then you sow the seed to a conflict like this. The seriousness of the situation is also that it's not only a question of their establishing a presence on the territory. Even if they will be removed from territory, the idea is still planted in the heads of many young men in particular, who might continue this so-called fight in other places, including in other countries, not only in the Middle East. So I think it's a very, very serious situation. And therefore, sometimes I say, when we are coming to a close, because Caroline, you have said at noon we would stop, I always ask the question, why is it so difficult to transfer wisdom from one generation to another? Why should we be repeating the mistakes? And I think the panel here has explained very interestingly how different aspects come into the picture here, and that the common denominator is that there is no other way ahead than the rule of law and to bring justice to people. And Kofi Annan often says, in relation to your first question, there is no peace without justice. At the moment you allow a former dictator or a warlord to escape justice, you've sown the seed to the next warlord or the next dictator. Because they say, well, whatever I do, nothing will happen to me. And their subordinates, they don't care for a moment what happens to them. So I think this is so important. And I think that is why it's so important to have people like members of the panel here who have actively worked on this. I have been more on the legislative side and the UN, so I have not been on one of these calls myself. I've been participating in setting them up. but the people who are actually working in the field, that sometimes risking their own security in doing so, are so important. So I think, on that note, with the respect for those who have participated in our discussion this morning, I think we can call the meeting to a close. May I ask for a big hand for the panel.